Donc, on va commencer avec
So we're going to start with
un talk de Laurent
Laurent Blanc-Pattin,
ici présent,
here in the studio,
Proxy
PO and developer, who's going to talk about contentful modeling and a fundamental topic when we think about structuring and sustainability. So Laurent, over to you. Thank you, Stéphane. I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Laurent Blanc-Pattin. I'm a proxy product owner at Caliop. So I'm mainly the link between the product, the customer, and the development teams. I've worked more specifically on several projects with Accor, with Contentful, notably wellness, which we just talked about, but also food and beverage and Accor corporate. And I've been involved more specifically in working on content modeling, which is the subject of this talk. Let's start by defining what content modeling is. It can be divided into three fairly simple steps. The first is break down your content into different content types. So a fairly obvious example is a blog with posts and authors who write these posts. That's two content types. The second step is to divide these types into a set of fields that will allow us to define them. For posts, for example, we can have title and content. The authors will have a first name, a last name, etc. And the third step will be to define the relationships between these different types. Still using the same example, an obvious relationship is the author of a post, since an author writes a post. So why is content modeling important? And how can we ensure it? I didn't ask you the question. Did you notice? I didn't, and that's fine. We have the first essential aspect of a good data schema, which is reusability. This will allow us to create our content once and be able to reuse it in different places, either on a page, the pages of a product, via different channels, languages, and so on. The second essential aspect is the consistency of the data, which must follow a predictable structure, making it easier to query, display in the front end of our product, and even administer, which reduces administrative costs, editing, or maintenance costs. The third aspect, which is maybe the most important, is scalability. So the ability of our model to evolve over time to support changes in the workflow, roles, internationalization with language changes, but also changes in media, automation, so on. So now that we've defined the theory, we looked at what a content model is and how it benefits our product. We're going to see how it works in practice with clear examples to avoid pitfalls that can kind of take us further away from these three aspects and to ensure good content model. The first pitfall is being too dependent on the front end. To illustrate this, we'll use a fairly simple example of customizable cards that can be customized via their content. So they might have texts, KPIs, quotes, images, but also in their design. So they can have different sizes, backgrounds, orientations. So we might ask ourselves how to model this particular case. We have this component that exists and we want the model in Contentful. So we have a first approach, which is to say we have several variants of cards, so we'll create a content type for each variant. A first content type for a blank card, for example, with a quote, a second content type with a large image, a third with a text that's aligned to the right, and so on. So each content type will have a set of fields that will be specific to each variant. Why is this approach problematic? We could say it allows us at first to clearly identify which content type corresponds to which variant and therefore offers a form of comfort to the contributor and the editor. But the problem is that we're going to see a huge amount of content types depending on the number of variants of our components, which could potentially cause the quantity to explode, which could be problematic depending on the size of your Contentful space. In terms of pure data semantics, we might have several content types for a single single element, which is the card. And finally, and this is the most decisive disadvantage, we will have a very poor scalability due to the dependence on the design system, since with each change to the mockups, for example, in V2, we add a new variant, we will have to create a new content type that can have a very significant impact on editing, the content model itself, but also on data retrieval and front-end integration. How can we improve this content model? Well, in fact, we're going to compact it into a single content type that will allow us to control both the content, either through a reference to another type that we have, a text type, quote, for rich text or for more flexibility, but also the design with a set of fields that will allow us to manage the size, orientation, background, and so on. So all the parameters that will generate the different variants on the front end. So this new content model will allow us to have a single content type for a unique element, which is our card. So we save on content types. Next, it's much easier to adapt to other use cases. If in my version 2, I only want to use certain card variants for another component or another page, I will be able to use the same content type and control it much more easily via these different fields. And finally, we have independence from the design system, which was the most important point, making it much simpler when adding variants or modifying only the options of one of the fields. It's much less of a structural change. And finally, as a small bonus, better performance since we have fewer network requests. So that was the first use case that shed light on the first fairly common pitfall that is encountered when defining a content model. The second pitfall is what we call over-engineering. Let's say that's excessive complexity, unnecessary complexity in relation to our needs. It's a little more complex to illustrate, so we'll use a slightly more complicated example of a navigation bar that is found at the top of most websites, which allows us to navigate through the different pages of the site. This navigation bar has the distinctive feature of having links but also submenus via an entry point that allows us to open a first level of submenus, which will itself contain links or submenus, to open a second level with other links up into the third level that will only have links. There are no more submenu openings since the nesting has to stop at some point. Same thing, we have to ask ourselves how to model this component and how to meet our needs. Well, we can identify a pattern of recursion through elements that seem somewhat identical to each other, so a list of links and submenus. This recursion can be modeled in Contentful via a potentially unique content type, which we can give a name, like a generic menu item name, which will then either have links or a children field that will be a reference to the same content type. This can be perfectly modeled in Contentful, and it works. The problem is that there are too many disadvantages. Even if the solution seems elegant, since we save on content types, we saw in the previous example, we have a recursive logic that fits our front-end needs. The issue is that we have no control over the depth. We don't have anything in terms of data editing to prevent the administrator from contributing 1, 2, 3, or 4 levels of submenus without necessarily having a limit. Then we make editing more complex because it will be difficult for the editor to realize the level of depth at which they are. We're also going to have a problem of the complexity of the data schema and, by extension, the front end, since, of course, we'll have to manage the rules and constraints that are specific to each submenu, making it much more difficult to identify at what level we are and how to apply these rules. And finally, in the same way, we'll have much less granularity in the cache management at the level of menu differences. So here, much in the same way as the previous example, we're going to ask ourselves, how can we improve this content model to overcome these problems without creating new ones? So we're going to start with a model that's much closer to the front-end component, try to map or copy the front-end requirement. So we'll have to have a first level, level 0, which corresponds to our main navigation. We'll have a list of items. These items refer to a new content type that we will call more explicitly submenu level 1, which will itself have a list of items that will reference another new content type, submenu level 2, and so on until we have our list of links which will not allow us to reference new content types. So what problem are we solving? First of all, we have total control over the depth, since we know precisely that the editor cannot contribute more than 3 levels of submenus, as there is no content type suitable for more levels. Then we have made editing much more simple, and therefore the data validation much simpler as well. The editor knows exactly which submenu level they are on every time they edit their navigation menu. And finally, we have a structure that is flat, more predictable, easier to document, but also to retrieve on the front end, as opposed to what I was saying before, and therefore it's easier to integrate. So here, you can see that unlike the previous example, we have actually increased the number of content types rather than reduced it. And this is to emphasize the fact that the idea is not necessarily to have an absolute number of content types. We'd like to reduce them at all costs, but rather to have the minimum number to meet the needs of both the product and the editors. If having a single content type makes editing completely impossible or more laborious, then it's just not the right choice. Now let's talk about scalability, an essential point of a good data model. For scalability, we're not going to use a specific example since it involves too many aspects, so instead we have a checklist of things that you need to define before choosing the content model. First will be translations and localizations, which Baptiste will talk about in more detail. The idea is to ask ourselves how to manage a locale, a site in content editing, but also in terms of how it's displayed on our front end, how to manage content that's been partially contributed in one language and not on another, etc. These are questions that have a major impact on the structure of your system, or if you change sites, or if you add a new language or internationalization. The second point is media management in much the same way. These can have a significant impact on our data structure if we don't think about them prior, especially if the native asset Contentful that we have is not sufficient for our needs. If we need more detailed management or image transformation or mandatory fields such as credits or alt text for accessibility. Then we look at the navigation pattern, which is an essential element that represents how the different pages of the site are organized and how, in general, the navigation is organized. Most of the time, the problem that comes up most is the breadcrumb trail. How do we model a page hierarchy on our site? Does each page correspond to a content type, or do we manage them via a simpler URL field? These questions can have a significant impact on the content model. And to go further, and this could be a subject of its own, but we have the multi-space question. If we have strong needs for data segmentation or needing a more refined role management in our database. To complete this checklist, we're going to talk about best practices, and I think this is more mandatory than good in terms of best practices. The first of these is testing and feedback from developers, obviously, but also and above all from editors, since they will be the end users of our content model. It is therefore extremely important to take their feedback into account, particularly on aspects that may not have been anticipated in terms of use of data in Contentful. And the second point, which is just as important, documentation. This can have a very simple form such as text or help text, which is a small label that you find below the fields which provide additional information, but also through field validation, constraints such as character limits, format constraints for example, email fields, and they can help with both documentation and maintenance for the developer, especially if we have constraints that are standardized across data schemas. And finally, in a slightly more traditional format through external documentation that'll help developers and publishers with documentation to assist with contribution, maintenance, and scalability of the project in general. So we've just seen various aspects that seem essential, in particular front-end independence, a flat structure that is therefore predictable, but also scalability, which contributes to all the aspects of a good content model and to the longevity of your product for developers and publishers. Thank you, Stéphane, and handing over.
Thank you, Laurent. Thank you for your presentation. We'll be now talking about the live preview that was presented by Clément Darrouzes. I'm not going to make the joke about Clément Darrouzes with two S, S-E. Shame, I was waiting for that one. Well, thank you, Stéphane, for this handover. So I'm going to talk about the live preview. So to quickly introduce myself, my name is Clément. I've been more than 8 years I've been with Kaliop, and currently I'm the lead developer. And so, as Stéphane said, we'll be talking about previewing. So today, Contentful offers a live preview feature, and in the demonstration context, I'm going to show you it in conjunction with the Next.js framework. So I'll be running a demo in the background, but basically, what is a live preview? It's an interface where you can have the input form for your usual content for your Contentful, which will be on our left and on the right. The panel will be divided into two. You'll find yourself with a website with your chosen environment, and it's really the actual website where all the changes you make in the input form will appear in real time on your website. So this will allow the user to test the changes for future publications. And the important point is that it is not affecting the publication of this content. Basically, we are only working on drafts, and the user will have the choice in the end to publish or not the content if he is happy with it and if it meets his needs. So how do we set this up? Well, there are some things that are mandatory. We need a Contentful space and a project next. And the next project, in my case, and then as well live preview library, which is provided directly by Contentful publisher. You can either get it on GitHub or on your preferred dependency manager. And also, I'll give you a link towards documentation written by Contentful, and that explains the basics of how to set up this feature and how it works. So it's a good starting point in addition to the library documentation to understand how it works. That's, however, what I'm going to show you right now. So now let's talk about the implementation. You can see in the title I'll be talking about the draft mode, but we'll come back to that later. Basically, what you need to do first is to create an API route for your project Next. There are several parameters. One of them is going to be important, the slug, which is represented. That is our URL identifier and a secret. The secret is mainly used to secure the route. So basically, we want this route to be used only by Contentful and no one else. And due to this, with the help of this secret, we will be able to check if this value is the right one, and if not, reject the user so that no one can enable the access to, not to enable the access to this route to anyone. So then we're going to be using the Next draft mode. Basically, it's a QShell box that Next provides us with, and so we can play around with different app modes. So how it's going to work, in our case, we will be retrieving the draft mode instance and activating it. So what is that going to do? Basically, it's going to add the header, a cookie, and that is going to be named pre-render bypass. The name is very important because basically that is what is going to enable the disabling of in the rendering mode that will configure that you will configure in your projects, for example SSR or something else. And so this will force dynamic rendering. So this will allow me to receive new data for my input from the refresh my web page to see what these changes made. So once I'm able to retrieve my draft mode instance and activate it, I just have to redirect the user towards the content that is initially requested. So additionally to that, the draft mode documentation is very well written on the Next website, and it explains the whole setup and what happens behind the scenes. So it's quite handy. Now we're able to activate our draft mode. We will have to use it. For that, now when you'll be fetching your data in the project Next, in your pointy page TX, before you fetch them, you'll actually be able to retrieve the status of the draft mode. Basically, you'll be in the presence of a cookie that will inject earlier, and we'll be able to retrieve the bulletin 1 and found out the draft mode is enabled. So this bullet 1 value will be used to institute the correct client content of Contentful. Basically, we're going to use the Contentful API, and this is a normal process. So once the draft mode is activated, it's going to be in draft form, and then we'll be able to visualize it without having an effect on the application. So I'm going to use that bullet 1 value. Once I have all of that, I will be able to use the library that has been provided by the publisher. In the React version, we have an access to the component that will allow us to initialize the library. So you have to insert it into your DOM, pass 3 important parameters, and the library will be ready to be used. So the first parameter is the local. In my example, I've put it in hard code, because it's only configures once local. But if you have a multilingual site, just pass the URL that you can retrieve via a router and get the current language that the user is using. Then there is a first value that is enabled live update, which will enable you to activate the feature. So that is why if you look at the same value of the draft mode, you will know if you can activate that feature or not. Third property, I'll get back to it a little bit later, but this will allow me to activate the inspection mode, which I'll describe in a few slides. Once you have done that, you have initialized the Contentful live preview library. Important point, this component has to be inserted in a component that is itself a use client, because the library provided the publisher uses the client JS code. So that is why it's required that this component cannot be inserted into your page TX. If you have to go for a fetch that is asynchronous, then it can become a conflict. So you have to just be attentive to that. And the last step, once your library is ready, you'll be able to use a hook that the library provides you with as well, which will allow you to retrieve all the updates that come from the input form. So how does it work? An input, we give our content. So that will be the result of the previously fetched content. In return, it gives us the same entry, but all the updates that the user makes in their input form. And then this new variable that we'll be using in the component tree will be displayed in our source and in the fields that we have defined the type of content. Just be aware, as previously, this hook must be used in a component that is a use client for exactly the same reasons. And so you can imagine simply the hook is working exactly like a listener. You give it an entry to listen to, and in return it gives you the updates in real time. Once you have that, technically speaking, our functionality is in place. The last step is to configure the live preview in Contentful. So in the settings menu, we can create a configuration as we want. So the best thing to do is often to create one per defined environment, and for each of these environments, you'll be able to define the content type for which you want the live preview to be available. And we can see in the GIFs playing in the bottom, so that's our live preview URL. And that's the URL that we have defined with a previous API and send it to the necessary parameters. Our secret, our slug, it can be as well the local if needed. I don't need it in my one, but it can be done. So once that is done, your live preview is functional. And so when you have the preview button on the right-hand panel, the redirection will take you to the view that we have seen at the introduction. So I'm going to go back to the inspector mode. That's the same thing. The library provides you with getProps functions that will allow you to add HTML data attributes in your DOM. So we're going to put that in each of our fields because we can see that these parameters will take the ID of our entry. The ID string will correspond to the identifier of the content field. And thanks to that, what will happen is that the GIFs will create an overload on the front end, and now when we have to hand over our fields, there will be an edit button, and once you click on it, it's going to autofocus our fields in our input form. So it's really handy when the site starts evolving. You'll have a lot of content types. Each content type will have a lot of fields. Well, rather than searching for it in your content tree, then you can directly click on the field and edit it in my interface. So the autofocus is, you can play around with it, and you need to know that this interface is quite powerful and it's really efficient, as you can see. Don't worry if you're using other technologies for front end. If you're not on React or Next, that will work as well with Vue, Next, Angular, or any other frameworks. The library provides you with equivalents of what we've seen in AGS gates. So basically, we have a function to initialize the library that takes exactly the same parameters, and we'll have access to a subscribe function that will do the equivalent of the hook and enable to listen to the enter and return every change each time there is one. The only thing that the only issue or the extra effort that has to be made, depending on the responsiveness of your front end, is that it might take a little longer to update your fields, but it's entirely possible. So now you know how to set up your live preview, whether it's technically speaking or in the interface. And I recommend you use it because it is a pretty strong point for your client, especially for their contributors to be able to test their content safely without any impact on the publication. So I recommend you try it out on a demo project. And I'll hand over to Stéphane. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Clément, for that great presentation. I'll hand over to Pierre Cavalet, technical expert who will talk to us about ISR, incremental server regeneration. That's what we say, right, in English? Pierre, it's all yours. Thank you, Stéphane. So I'm here to talk about ISR, or incremental static regeneration. You said it very well. The acronym isn't easy. We're going to look at how it integrates with Next.js and Contentful. So I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Pierre Cavalet. I'm a technical expert at Kaliop, and I work mainly on building composable architecture, and I also work on evolving our developmental practices. So today for the presentation, we are joined by two characters, Thomas, who is a contributor, and Michael, who will be a user. The use case we're going to look at is Thomas, the contributor, who wants to modify his page. He has a hero, a homepage hero area where the title that says transform your digital future. He wants to add amazing in the middle. So we'll see what happens when he tries to make this modification. Today we're going to explore several things. First, we're going to do a quick repack of what server-side rendering and static-side generation is, because this is a starting point for understanding why we used ISR. Then we'll explore how the ISR works and what problems it solves compared to the other two rendering modes we saw earlier. And finally, we'll finish by seeing what Contentful offers to make the ISR work properly in terms of tools. So, quick recap on how it works. Server-side rendering. Michael arrives and makes his first request. It goes through all the layers we've presented and they're on screen, which are displayed, for example, a CDN cache, Next.js, Next is arbitrary, it could be NX or it could be something else. And Contentful, on the other hand, he makes his request, he types it into the CDN. The request takes time because there's no cache on the CDN side, and Next.js is generating the page, which goes to Contentful to fetch the data. This sends it back to the cache, and then the CDN puts it in response to Michael's page. We are all familiar with this process. This is the moment when our browser takes a little bit of time. It's grinding away. It's not very pleasant in terms of user experience. That's why Michael, he's not happy right now. He's looking at his watch. He's waiting. And then when he comes back, the page is in a cache. So the CDN responds directly. And that's the advantage of having the cache in the front of server-side rendering, which is what we do on many projects. Then we have our other case. We have Thomas arriving and going to do his update on Contentful. He does his update, but then we have to notify that there's been a change. So we send a purge request to the CDN to tell it to remove the cache because there's been a change. We remove it, and then when there's this kind of scenario, we fall back to the same scenario as before. Michael has to wait because Thomas has made a change. So we're back to the first case. That's basically how server-side rendering works. Static side generation works differently. We have a runner. A runner can be many things: your machine, your computer, your CI/CD, the machine that runs your CIDC or runs your server, anything that can run Next.js, basically. So we're going to put Next.js in it, and we're going to have Contentful and an S3 bucket. So it could be anything that can hold static files. And the goal is to generate the site statically. So the runner will run Next.js, and it will generate all the pages of the site. And once it's finished, it sends all the pages to an S3 bucket. So that's the build part. And when Thomas arrives, he does his update, it notifies the runner, and the runner file does exactly the same job, rebuilding everything and sending everything back to S3. And overall, most SSG sites work like this. It's long, it has a lot of constraints. However, once it's done, we have the S3 bucket and a CDN cache, and everything goes fast. So the first call is very fast because the S3 bucket responds extremely quickly, and we quickly put the cache in the CDN. And the second one goes even more quickly because we only go through the CDN, so we fall back of the nominal case of C and cache. The advantages and disadvantages of these parts to the SSR will be that the content will be much fresher, newer. On the other hand, there will be moments that are quite slow when there's no cache. This is particularly true when contributors come in because they will break the cache when developers make code updates. And the SSG is a bit the opposite. We'll have pages that are always very fast, but the build times are longer. So either we sacrifice and we have content that isn't up to date, or we have build times that are particularly long because the site is big, and so we've got to build 10,000 pages, even if only 5 of them are being visited. And we also have the problem that every time we send code, we have to rebuild the entire platform. So incremental static regeneration is somewhere between the two. The goal being to maximize cache usage. To do this, we're going to sacrifice a little bit of content being new or fresh or updated. We're also going to avoid, throwing resources out the window that you can do with SSG when we generate 10,000 pages and very few of them are used. And finally, we'll see what tools are necessary to manage the individual cases where we want to ensure that the content is updated immediately. A quick disclaimer, when we give the presentation on DSR, we'll skip CDN because it complicates the workflow quite a bit. We mustn't forget we're just skipping it because it could be the subject of a whole talk, but depending on the CDN, there are lots of different features and we can do lots of different things. So we'll skip it, but you must keep in mind that you do need one. So ISR, how does it work? We start with Next.js, and they're going to have a cache layer. This cache layer can be an S3, a Redis, in-memory, F-system, a lot of things, but whatever happens, it's Next.js that drives it and pilots it. It has to access it. It has to do sets and has a cache layer. Then we have Contentful, which will be our content system, where we're going to define metrics that are revalidation and expiration. Revalidation, we'll set it to 1 hour and the expiry to 1 day. These are the metrics that can change. I will start the presentation of the page that's already in the cache because it's easier to understand how it regenerates after it's initially loaded. So we start with the first user who arrives 5 minutes after the page has been generated. So they request the page from Next.js, and Next.js returns the page directly because it has it in the cache. Then we have our use case. Thomas arrives and wants to add his amazing in Contentful, so he does his update and he leaves. Now Contentful is up to date. We have another user who arrives 30 minutes later. He makes his request, same thing, he receives the page. He receives the page, but without amazing because it was the page that was in the cache and it hasn't been updated. Then we go through our revalidation period. So after 1 hour, the content is marked as stale, meaning it's past its revalidation period. But a third user arrives an hour and a half later and makes a request. And then they also retrieve this page. They retrieve the page that is stale and also without amazing. And this is very important to understand. They don't receive the page the fact that we've passed the revalidation period. Why? Because they're the first user to arrive after this revalidation period. So what's going to happen in addition is we're going to add a task that's going to be triggered in the background on Next.js, and this task will take care of regenerating the page for the next users. So we've responded quickly to the user who arrived after an hour and a half, and in the meantime, we're regenerating the new page. And when we have a new user arising, the new page contains the word amazing, and the new user, after an hour and 35 minutes, will retrieve the new page that was generated by the previous user with the word amazing. And so that's the purpose of ISR. It's important to note that the pages are not refreshed every hour when you configure revalidation after 1 hour. They're refreshed based on traffic. This avoids a series of revalidation for pages that are not being used. The page is only regenerated when the user has the page in orange. And what's more, the big advantage is that all the pages we've served, despite the fact that there's one that is stale, they're all cached. So they all load quickly. There's no slow pages like when you use SSR. If we exceed the expiration period and no one has visited, which we will want to avoid, then we fall back on SSR, and that will be the next cache to be initialized. We all have a problem that will arise when we want to do this, and that's Thomas. Thomas is going to say, hey, waiting an hour is not possible, and I'm not going to wait an hour plus the time it takes for a user to arrive in some cases. So we need to find a solution for that. So we have something called on-demand revalidation. The revalidation request has the same structure as what we had earlier. Michael arrives, the page is in cache, we give it to him. However, when Thomas arrives, if Thomas wants to, he can notify us in some way or another, which we'll see later. In Next.js, I want to force revalidation. So we can send to Next.js, we need to revalidate this page. And so what we will do is delete the page from the cache. And if we do nothing, Michael will make his request. It will end up in the very first case we had. This will trigger SSR, which will be used to rewarm the cache that we have and retrieve its page and start again. The revalidation request basically forces the default expiration. An important point to know that if you want, you can also warm up this cache to prevent Michael to take an SSR hit. We can say Next.js, when we invalidate the cache, we can also tell it to regenerate the page. We don't do this by default to avoid regenerating too many pages, but we can. So Contentful and all this, what does it do? Well, it's a big toolbox that gives us all the tools we need. Webbooks, SDK, extensible BO, I'll present them just after, and it will be used for the revalidation request and the live preview and draft mode. It will be used to ensure that what Clément presented earlier works despite the fact that there is a cache, meaning we're going to bypass the entire ISR process and we'll be able to see the preview of our content despite the fact that there is content in cache on production. So we're focusing on Webbook, SDK, and extensible BO for the following examples. So the first solution for validation requests is to add a magic button. We're going to use this button, Purge Cache. It's a very simple way to put it in the content that corresponds to the pages, and any contributor can click on it and remove the cache. This seems simple, but it might not be the best way. But in the end, it is one of the best solutions because it actually lets the ISR system work work on its own, and it's just edge cases that come up that are forced. So we keep all the benefits of the ISR, which is to regenerate content only when we really need to regenerate it. If we want to do something more sophisticated and automated, we can do something using webbook and SDKs. We need to understand how our pages are composed to do so. On the right, I've got two pages. On the left is the home page, and on the right is the product page. We have to understand how they're composed. So I've separated them into components that I have numbered. We'll consider these IDs 1 to 10, and we can see that number 5 is shared between the two pages. So in terms of structure, we will have our two pages of home and product, and we'll see all the components that are part of Contentful, and we will have the relationships to these components. And once we have this data modeling, we'll have several solutions. The first will be to try to find the pages from the components we are editing. For example, I'm editing component 5. What we want to do is modify my component 5. Contentful triggers a webhook which says, warning, Next.js component 5 has been updated. So Next.js will call Contentful again and say, I want to retrieve all the pages that correspond to component 5. So we go back up the hierarchy with SDK, and those are the blue arrows. And once we've retrieved these pages for home and products, Next.js will call itself. It will use a feature. It will say, I want to invalidate the home page and the product page. That's one way of doing it. It's the easiest to understand, but it's not necessarily the easiest to implement because it's not easy to, if you have edge cases, or if we only want to do it in certain cases. The third solution is to do this with tags, and this is the most elegant solution if we want to automate it. So here the idea is that if we're going to use a feature that will allow us to tag the cache from the home and the product with their different content use. So here we've got up to 6 components and for the home, and in the product you've got 5 and 7 to 10. So in their cache, we're going to put that back in the cache of the home page, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in the same product, we're going to put in the tags that correspond. So here when we're working on our overflow, we're going to take the Contentful that will send its webhook to Next.js. It'll say, careful, Contentful 5 has been modified, and then we're no longer need to do this juggling act of retrieving the corresponding pages or building the hierarchy structure. It will directly use its functionality and invalidate all pages that contain tag 5. So this is a slightly more elegant solution than the previous one, which cannot be used on all systems, but in the latest versions of Next.js, we can do that. We can put tags based on responses or requests that we make to Contentful. So overall, in terms of ISR, what we need to keep in mind is that it's one tool among many, and that it's not necessarily the answer to everything, but it's a good tool to use. We can do projects, we're going to use ISR everywhere, and it can work well for today's subject, but we could also say that using ISR is cool, I need it for a particular feature, and I'll leave everything else in SSR, for example, or I can mix it up with SSG or other things. The other thing to keep in mind is that on-demand revalidation is a very interesting feature to avoid issues related to ISR, but we mustn't abuse it. We shouldn't use it all the time, because if we do, we lose the benefit of the automatic ISR revalidation system, since we'll regenerate pages not when the ISR would have wanted. And the other point we must not forget is that when we define our metrics, meaning everything that needs to be revalidated or expired, we must do it in consultation with the whole team. We need to include the tech people in these discussions. We need to include the people who manage the infrastructure to check that it works, that it's affordable, that we have enough cash, but also include contributors so that these metrics don't hinder them too much and that workarounds are rarely used and they don't become the norm. So overall, Michael shouldn't systematically destroy the cache every time he makes an update. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found it interesting.
Well, thank you, Pierre, and thank you, Michel and Thomas, for the illustration of these points. We're going to end this morning with a talk from Baptiste Leulliette, who you may perhaps have already seen last year in the last Experience Conf, who today in the morning will be talking to us about the procedure of translation and how to use Contentful in that international context. Baptiste, it's up to you. Thank you, Stéphane. Yes, I'll be talking about industrialization of your internalization. Okay, so my name is Baptiste. I am the technical expert in Kaliop. So I'll ask the first question. So, why do you need good internalization? Why? Because overall, we'll see our contributor Thomas, the same that we've seen on the previous slides. So Thomas wants us to speed up and improve the contribution experience. Overall, what we need is to encourage second level of thinking about content modeling. So here we'll come back to Laurent said in his talk, which is we need to think not about the content, but about my content on several levels. And finally, we have to make sure that our development experience makes the most out of these translations and does it the most efficiently possible. On the other hand, what makes it worse? Overall, Thomas is not happy when we want him to do manual tasks and increase the cognitive overload of the contributor. So let's imagine that in all your content, you have fields that are 100% translated. Here is no intelligence that has been built into the implementation of the data structure, and so all your fields are translated, and that means that Thomas has to duplicate all of his content. So he also has to fill up the gaps for the lack of metrics on the percentage rate of translation towards other language is going to be really long, not knowing whether the content is translated or not. It's okay when there are 20 of them, but when you have 50,000, it's much more complicated. As the point was made by Laurent, he was saying that, okay, well, I've launched my first country, that's great, but I need to launch the second one. Okay, have you thought about it? What should I do? So we'll have several solutions, and we have different natives Contentful internationalization feature. Okay, I was ready to stutter there. So overall, Contentful with his local fallback is great. It works pretty well. It works really well. Let's imagine that you have a French product. So you will set up, you have set it up, you already have your product in France, you already have your content, and you want to add a content model, and you want to add a specific translation for Canada. So you can go into Contentful, define in the language fallback system of local entry, that is, in the input mask, define a fallback of one field to another. So here in this case, we first see the first field, we see the French version of the content, and in the second field, just beneath it, we have the Canadian version. So here we can see in the title, my content is self-explanatory. French is sufficient for Canadian, for the Canadian language, so I'm going to use my fallback. However, in my short description, here I have a short description of 15 minutes how to translate my content to French. However, Canadians, with no offense to our dear Canadians, it's just 15 minutes to know how to translate my content, damn it. So I want to add a better pitch for my Canadian compatriots, so I don't want to use the fallback. And so the response from the API, the CMA, the Content Management API, we can see the Canadian local and find both our French title, which will be the holdback, that is internalization, and the short description, which is our famous Canadian swear word. So that works. So here's how it works, that it explains the first point, that there's no need to indicate all fields as translatable. You can really take the advantage of the translation system and the Contentful fallback system to achieve your goals without having to duplicate your entire account. We can go even further in the fallbacks, and we can have several levels. Dependent or not. So here we have 6 logos. We define the French as our default language, and the second last is going to be the Belgian language as a fallback for French, and then the Guinean French as a fallback for Belgium. So don't ask me for a use case, I don't have one. The fact is that it is possible.
À côté de ça, on peut retrouver donc
Besides that, we can
l'anglais
find
qui n'a pas de
English,
fallback
which has no
et
fallback,
avoir un fallback
and
australien,
have an
donc au
Australian
même cas que notre
fallback.
français et le
So,
canadien,
in the
avoir
same
un
case as
fallback
for French and
spécifique
Canadian,
pour
have
avoir
a
du
specific
contenu
fallback to
spécifique
have
à un marché.
specific
Et
content for a
avoir des
market,
langues qui,
and
du
have
coup, n'ont juste
languages
pas de fallback,
do
en
not have
l'occurrence,
a
par
fallback,
exemple,
such
l'arabe.
as the Arabic language.
Sur un second point, donc du coup,
So on a second
comment on
point,
industrialise la traduction.
how do we
Donc, on
industrialize
retrouve
translation?
Thomas, notre très cher
We have
contributeur.
Thomas, our dear contributor.
Il fait une traduction, il veut une
He
traduction
carries out a
humaine.
translation.
Il veut
He
une
wants
relecture
human
humaine de son
translation. He
contenu.
wants proofreading of his
Donc, du coup,
content.
comment on peut mettre en place
So
un
how can we
système de
set up a
traduction
system
industrialisé tout en restant à une échelle humaine?
industrialized translation
étape,
system while remaining in a
Thomas
human
publie son
scale?
contenu en français
First
dans
step, Thomas
Contentful.
publishes his content in French in
Contentful doit
Contentful.
déclencher un webbook
Contentful
sur le
will
publish country,
trigger a webbook on a
pour
published
déclencher
country
un backend, un
to
backend
trigger
quelconque.
a
En
backend,
l'occurrence, chez nous, sur notre
whatever
projet, on
backend.
a utilisé
In
ça,
our,
c'était une lambda AWS.
for example, a project that
Une
was
fois que cette
Lambda
lambda a reçu le
AWS.
webbook, elle va venir
Once
utiliser
Lambda
Transperfect. Donc, Transperfect est une
has received the
une entreprise
webbook,
qui est
it will
spécialisée
use
dans la traduction de contenu
Transperfect. Transperfect is the
fait
company
par
that
des
specializes in
humains.
human translation
Et
of
donc,
content.
du coup, on va exploiter leur API
So
pour
we're going to use their API
demander un nouveau job à
to
Transperfect
request a
de
new
traduction
job
de ce contenu.
for Transperfect to translate the
reçoit le
content.
job,
So
il
Transperfect
travaille,
receives the
il
job,
revient un peu plus
they
tard.
work, and it comes
Il a
back
fini
to us a
sa
little
traduction.
later. They have finished their
Et donc,
translation,
c'est Transperfect
and it's
qui va
Transperfect
revenir
that
vers nous,
comes,
donc vers Contentful,
comes
pour
back
indiquer,
towards
OK, mon
Contentful
contenu est traduit.
to indicate, okay, my
Voilà le
content is
contenu.
translated.
Et
Here it
donc,
is.
moi, en tant que
And so
Transperfect,
me
je
as
viens
Transperfect,
mettre à
I
jour
update
ma traduction
my
grâce à la CMA. Donc, la
translation with the use of the
Content
CMA,
Et
so
là, du
the
coup, Thomas, il
content
est content.
management
Parce que Thomas,
API.
il
And
n'a
so Thomas
publié
is
qu'une version
happy
française.
because he has published
se
only the
retrouve,
French version,
après
and
un
he
lapsus
finds
de temps,
himself after a lapse of time,
laps de temps plutôt, il
lapse
se
of
retrouve
time,
avec une version
he finds
anglaise
himself with
de
the
son contenu.
version in English.
Petit tip, avec
A
le
little
fait de
tip,
pouvoir customiser
with the
le
ability to
back-office,
customize
du
the
coup, nous, ce
back
qu'on a fait, c'est
office,
qu'on a
what
fait un
we
petit widget,
do is that
qui
we
nous
have
permet de voir
small widgets that allow
où en
us
est
to
Transperfect
see where we
sur la
are
gestion de la traduction.
where
Donc
Transperfect
là, en
is
l'occurrence,
currently
on
in
peut
the
voir que
translation
la
process.
traduction
So here, in this
espagnole,
case, we can
elle
see
est
that
en
Spanish
cours,
translation is in
que la
progress.
version, non, je crois que c'est la version allemande
No,
est en
I
cours,
think
la
that
version
the German
espagnole a
version
été
is still
traduite,
in
et la
progress.
version
The Spanish one
allemande
is
tout en bas,
translated,
elle est
and
queued, elle n'est pas encore traitée, donc elle
the
va arriver
last
plus tard.
line, it
Ça permet
is the Spanish
de
translation is
savoir
queued
où
and
on
will be
en est
translated later.
dans
So
notre
this allows
contenu
us to
et de
understand where we are
quand est-ce
in
qu'on
our
aura
content
une date
and
approximative
when will we have an approximative
de la
date
traduction de notre contenu.
of the translation for our content.
Ce qui est important de savoir, donc j'en parlais
What
au
is
début,
important
c'était
to
de
know
récupérer des métriques
is
et
to get the
des
metrics,
infos sur votre
the
industrialisation.
information about your industrialization.
Ce que nous on a mis en place pour gérer
So we've put in
la métrique,
place
c'est de rajouter
to manage
un
the
champ
metrics is
technique,
to
donc
add
qui
a
n'a
technical
aucune valeur
field
éditoriale,
that has no
mais
editorial
qui va
value,
servir à des fins techniques.
but
Donc,
that will be
comme je vous
used for
indiquais,
technical
sur
purposes,
la
as I have
traduction,
mentioned about
l'état de
to
traduction de
inform you
votre
about the translation
contenu.
status.
Donc ce champ-là, il est traduisible.
So this
Et
field
donc,
is
ça nous permet de
translatable,
flaguer un contenu en
which
disant
allows us to flag the
est-ce qu'il est
content,
traduit, est-ce
to
qu'il est en
know
cours
if
de
it is
traduction,
translated,
est-ce
it's
qu'il
still
n'est
in
pas traduit,
process,
ou
or
est-ce
it's not
qu'il
yet
n'a juste
translated,
pas besoin de traduction.
or
On veut du
doesn't
contenu
it just
spécifique
doesn't
en
need
français,
translation. We
c'est
have
pas
only
applicable en
specific
anglais,
content in
donc
French, and
ça,
it's not applicable in English.
ça vous permet donc du coup
So this allows you
d'exploiter la
to
grille Contentful,
exploit
de
the
récupérer
Contentful
des métriques
API,
sur ce champ
the
technique
BI, and to
afin
retrieve metrics
d'indiquer
in the
un
technical
pourcentage
field
de
in order to
traduction
indicate the percentage of
de
translation
votre contenu et de pouvoir
of
l'afficher
your
dans un
content and
dashboard
displayed
custom
in
où
a
vous
custom
voulez
dashboard
récupérer
wherever
cette
you
information
wanted
simplement.
to retrieve this information very
Donc ça,
easily.
c'est pour la partie contenu spécifique.
So
Mais
this
on veut
is
aussi
a
gérer
specific content
le
part,
process.
but we also want to
Donc on
manage
veut
the
savoir
process.
si le
So
process va bien
we
et
want
on
to
veut
know
savoir si le
if the process is
continue de
working
fonctionner.
and if it continues
Donc pour ça,
working. So for
deux
that,
points. Le premier point,
there are two
c'est
points.
la
The
mise en
first
place
point
de logs
is the
pour
implementation
tracer
of the
le workflow.
logs
Donc
to
grosso
track
modo, ce
the
que nous, on a mis en
workflow. So
place, c'est
basically, what
un simple ping slack
we'll be pulling is going
qui
to
nous,
be a
qui nous
simple ping
raconte
slack
que l'entry
that tells us that the entry
nanana a été traduit et
whatsoever
publié en anglais.
has been
Comme ça,
translated
vous
and
savez
published in
que
English.
si sur
That
Slack, il
way,
se passe plus rien,
you know that
il se passe
in
quelque
this
chose.
Slack nothing is happening, then
Second
something is
point,
wrong.
vous pouvez aller monitorer le webbook
Secondly,
pour
you can
savoir
monitor the webbook to see
si le webbook fonctionne
if the
correctement.
webbook is working
Donc là, en
properly.
l'occurrence, vous pouvez aller dans la partie
So
webbook de
here this
Contentful.
means that you can log into the
voyez
webbook
votre
of
webbook. Et là,
Contentful. You
donc
can
là,
see
en
your
l'occurrence,
notebook, and you will see
le pourcentage d'appels réussis.
Percentage of successful calls. So here it is of 98.7%, so it's pretty good.
Qu'en est-il de l'IA?
So what happens with AI? Because we spoke about human translation, but
à l'ère d'aujourd'hui,
we today, in today's world, also want to talk about AI. So I would like to draw your attention to the right-hand side. We've added a widget that allows us to manage the translation. So here we have the content that has the description in French, but no description in English. So we can click on the widget, select the source field, select the destination field, click on Generate, apply, and we're done. I publish. I'm happy. Thomas is happy. Everyone is happy. Everyone's going back home. Happy.
Comment ça fonctionne? Donc,
how does it work? It's quite simple. There is an application in the marketplace that you can configure or customize and you install it. Not a lot of customization. The open API key, your LLM model, a lot of information about the context of your product. So the brand, what does it do? What are the keywords that need to be included? The keywords that need to be avoided, and that kind of information. And on what content you want to put your widget.
Grosso modo,
so overall,
ça couvre tous les besoins.
It covers all your
On
needs.
retrouve Thomas.
We go back to Thomas. Thomas, what does he need? He needs efficiency.
On rajoute les fallbacks de langue.
So we add language fallbacks.
Thomas, il a besoin
Thomas
de
needs
validation humaine de son contenu.
human validation of his
Votre contenu
content.
est complexe,
His
votre
content
contenu
is
est ultra
complex. It's
spécifique,
ultra
médical,
specific.
des choses comme
It's
ça.
medical.
Vous avez besoin d'une vérification
Or
humaine.
something, and so it needs
Branchez-vous
human
à une
verification. So
à une
connect
application tierce
to a third-party application
exploitez-la au maximum pour
and make
industrialiser votre
the
contenu.
most of it to
En l'occurrence,
industrialize your
pour
content.
Transperfect, ça
In
aurait
this
pu
case, it
être
was
localized
Transperfect. It would have been
et-
localized
ou d'autres.
or others.
Et pour finir, si vous avez besoin
And
de
finally,
vitesse,
if you need speed,
vous pouvez utiliser l'IA,
you can use
comme on l'a vu
AI,
juste avant, pour
as we've
traduire
seen, to
seulement les champs qui
translate
sont
only the
spécifiques
fields that are
et
specific
livrer très vite
and
votre contenu.
deliver
Pensez
your
à Thomas.
content very quickly.
Thomas,
So
il a
think about
beaucoup de choses à
Thomas.
faire,
Thomas has a
comme nous
lot of
tous,
things to
mais il
do,
a
as
besoin de
all of
livrer
us, and so he needs to deliver his content really
En
fast.
conclusion, donc,
So to
je
conclude,
réinsiste sur le
I
point,
would like
de
to
Laurent, qui était que
reiterate Laurent's
la
point
qualité du modèle
that
de
the
contenu
quality of the
sera votre
content
fondation
model will be a
principale pour votre
main
internationalisation.
foundation for
Il ne
internalization.
faut surtout pas hésiter
Don't
orchestrer
hesitate
vos flows de
to
traduction
orchestrate your translation
en
flow
ajoutant des applications
by
tierces.
adding third-party
Il faut
applications
absolument garder une trace
and
de votre
make sure
automatisation
to track
pour
the automation
vérifier que le
in order
process
to
fonctionne
verify that the
correctement
process
à
is
travers
working
du report.
correctly through the reporting.
Et c'est tout pour moi.
And that's all
passe
for
la
me.
parole à Stéphane.
I'll hand over
Merci
to
Baptiste,
Stéphane.
merci à tous les
Thank you,
quatre. Je
Baptiste.
crois que
Thank
vous avez
you, all
ensoleillé
four
la
of you.
matinée de pas mal de
I think you
développeurs
have
qui nous
brightened
regardaient.
our morning
En tout
today
cas, vous
for
avez
the
été
developers
surtout
that have been watching us.
dans le channel, là,
In
dans-
any
tout le
case,
monde a
we
bien
had of support
commenté, donc
in
c'était
the
super
channel.
sympa.
Everyone was commenting,
Merci
so it
pour
was
ces
really nice.
explications. On arrive
Thank you for the
déjà à la fin
explanations.
de cette matinée
So
de la
we
Headless Experience Conf
came
deuxième
to the
édition.
end of our morning
Donc,
with Headless
merci à
Experience
tout le monde,
Conf
merci à tous
second
les
edition.
participants
So
d'avoir
thank you,
joué
everyone.
le
Thank you
jeu.
to all the
Pour
participants
ceux
for
qui
having
êtes en ligne, là, et qui nous suivez,
participated.
n'hésitez
And for
pas
those who
à
have been following
commenter,
us online,
partager.
don't hesitate to comment
Vous
and
allez
to
recevoir sûrement
share.
un petit fichier de
You'll
feedback
probably
dans l'objectif de
receive
faire
a short
mieux la
feedback
prochaine fois, parce qu'on prépare
questionnaire
déjà la nouvelle édition.
with the aim to improve for
Voilà.
the
Je
next
crois que j'ai à peu près tout
edition
dit.
because we're already preparing
Donc,
for it.
je finis par les
So I think
remerciements
that's what
auprès des
I've
personnes.
said. I think I
Merci
need to
évidemment, énorme
thank
merci
everyone. So
aux équipes de Contentful
thank you
d'avoir
to
joué
the
le jeu,
Contentful
Hydro
team
Building
of
System à
Contentful,
Accor, à Contentful. Merci au
Hydro
studio
Building
PM de nous
Systems,
avoir
Contentful.
accompagnés, d'avoir fait
Thank you to
mis en place le
the
studio
PM
pour nous.
Studios PM
C'est top.
to having
Merci à tous ceux
organized
qui ont
and
joué
set
le
all
jeu
of
de
this efforts.
l'organisation
Thank you for
et de la
everyone who has
participation. Merci à
helped
tous
us
et on se
organize
revoit
and who
bientôt
has
pour une prochaine édition.
participated,
Merci beaucoup.
and hope to see you soon for our next edition.